Hey class, welcome back. In this lesson we're going to be looking at Henri Bergson's book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. This book came out, or was published in 1932. This was he has four major books. This was the last of his major books, and the one before it, Creative Evolution, came out in 1907, so there was quite a bit of time since then. And the last book that we were looking at, Time and Free Will, it came out in 1889. So this is more than 40 years after that, and much later in Bergson's life. So he spent a lot of time working on this book, obviously, since the one before it. And there was a lot that also went on during that time. There was a major debate with Einstein. So he had this debate with Einstein that I mentioned before. And he did come out with some articles and another smaller book that is not one of the major books, and compiled some of his earlier writings and stuff. So he was still active during that period, but he really focused a lot of his energy on this final book, which really brings together Bergson's whole philosophy. And as we could see already from Time and Free Will, questions of morality were on Bergson's mind throughout his life, even though it wasn't until this final book that took the center stage. And we know that in some of his early lectures, so in the French system, after you completed your doctoral work, you would teach high school for several years, I think even up to 10 years. And in that time, he was teaching philosophy to high school students and focused a lot on morality and said things that were very close to what he would say later in this book. So we know that it was something on his mind throughout his whole life. And the very central idea of Bergsonism, this distinction between absolute qualitative reality of duration, our immediate experience, its connection to emotions and all of that, creativity, art, versus the relative knowledge of science, of symbolic knowledge, external to reality, translating reality into terms that imitate and approximate reality. That duality of the two ways in which the human mind works, that is the basis of his moral theory. So there will be two kinds of morality, two kinds of religion. One will be an absolute form, and the other one will be a relative form, a closed society, a closed morality, closed religion, versus an open, creative, emotional religion and morality. So there are two sources of morality. The first source is social pressure. And this word pressure is really at the heart of Bergson's idea. So I'm just going to give you a kind of broad understanding of it at first. This is morality that we understand in terms of our intellect, that we can put into concepts and laws, and that we can write out formulas for, or even if it's not something intellectual and conceptual, it's something habitual. It's something statically created. We've been habituated to do it. It is something automatic. So habit and intellect are very closely connected for Bergson, as we've seen. And social pressure is something that we're trained into. We learn it over time, and we're habituated into it. Social pressure, static, closed religion, and morality, they give us an entirely practical and calculative moral system. Something that, like an eye for an eye, we can judge exactly how much each person deserves. That's closed morality. And this morality is static, or at least it pretends to be static. So once the customs and obligations of a certain society have been laid down, they pretend as if they had always been that way and as if it could never change. But Bergson looks at history here and shows how it has changed gradually throughout history. The other source of morality is aspiration. So on the one hand, we have pressure, social pressure coming from outside. The other source is aspiration, and it comes from inside. It wells up inside of us. And aspiration is connected for Bergson with the idea of intuition and creative emotions. So we've already seen how he's dealt with the idea of moral emotions as something that is internal to us. It's an inner feeling where we relate to ourselves. So these aspirations come from within, and they're a kind of self-esteem. They're a kind of raising of our motivating us and giving us a wind from within, right? Aspiration, the word is related to spirit. Bergson connects this with mysticism, and I'll talk about this more as we go, but mysticism for Bergson, he has people like Joan of Arc in mind. And these people, they have these like rapturous experiences where they are in the presence of God, or they feel divinity within them. But that's not all it is for Bergson. It's not just this rapturous state. Instead, it's the desire and realization of the desire to bring about a better world. So Joan of Arc, as one of these mystics, she actually changed society. She actually propels society forward and creates a new system in which we can understand societal relations. So aspiration gives a true morality, Bergson thinks, and it opens the heart. It's something that propels society forward, and therefore there's an evolution of human morality. So aspiration is not something where we lay down certain laws, or we create certain maxims and formulas by which our actions are pressured, restricted. Rather, it's a creation of a new feeling. It's a creative emotion that propels society forward. So the two sources, again, are pressure versus aspiration. Now, on the side of pressure, we have a social ego. Each one of us is pressured by society to form a social ego. The social ego, in the last lesson, we talked about a concrete self. So opposed to this concrete self, there is a superficial self. And this superficial self is the social ego for Bergson. So from a very young age, we are all conditioned by society. We are trained and brought into this social ego. We are measured by society, and we measure our own self in relation to society. So we form this social ego, this superficial self. Society teaches us to stick to the road that it marks out. It says, stick to this path, and you'll be part of society. And Bergson says that there's all these daily routines that we go through. None of them would be possible if it wasn't for our submission to the rules and obligations of society. So you can imagine going to the grocery store even, or something like that. Obviously, in the age of COVID, these things are changed and altered, but nonetheless, there's even more rules and obligations that we have to abide by, right? So all of these expectations for how you're going to interact with people in society are drawn out for us, and we are trained to follow them in order to have social cohesion. The social ego conditions us to be part of society, to be like everyone else. So the social ego binds us to society. We are bound to society by our conditioning and by this sense of obligation to society. We are given certain roles, and we have to play out these roles in order to stay within society. We're not in a classroom right now, but normally I would say to my students, in order to come into this classroom and to participate in education as an institution, you have to play a certain role. You have to play the role of a student. If one of the students stands up in front of the class and starts talking, I'm going to have to kick them out of the class. They've broken the rules, right? They aren't playing by their role. So society and social pressure involves this kind of prescribing of certain roles to everyone and expecting that everyone is going to partake in those roles. So in this way, duty emerges. Duty emerges from social pressure. So this is a really key idea for Bergson in morality. Kant says that basically that duty is the absolute source of morality. Duty being very closely connected to the will. For Kant, again, the will and the law are closely connected to each other, and the relationship between law and will produces duty. Duty is the interconnection between those two things, right? The feeling of duty. We legislate ourselves the feeling of duty, and we feel the duty that we have legislated. So it's this kind of feedback between these two things. But anyway, for Kant, duty is the source of morality. Well, Bergson completely rejects this. He says that no, duty is not the source of morality. It is the side effect of the source of morality. The source of morality is social conditioning. And social conditioning produces in us a feeling of duty. So he says at one point, if an ant, part of an ant society, somehow became self-conscious and felt a sense of deviance from society, as soon as it felt that, then its sense of duty would emerge again and say, no, you need to be returning to society. You need to not go off on your own. You need to not be individualistic or egotistical or any of these things. You need to be reconnected to society. And so that moment of becoming conscious of our possibility of leaving society. Obviously an ant can't do that, but we do that. We can do that. And so the feeling of needing to be reconnected to society, that's what Bergson calls an obligation. So duty is what emerges in reflective beings when they feel themselves deviating from society and needing to be reconnected to society. But already morality has emerged. It has emerged as the conditioning of individuals to follow society. So duty is a side effect, not a cause of morality. But anyway, so obligations and duty, all of this is something that evolves through our lives. It is gradually we are conditioned into it, and it becomes our second nature. So it's habituated in that sense. It's the second nature that we have. But for Bergson, it is completely external and impersonal. It's how we kind of overcome our individuality and become part of a greater whole. And now Bergson is very critical of this social ego, but he doesn't think that we can abolish it or that it should be abolished completely. It's something that's necessary for our education, for our coming to be able to interact with people in society. We couldn't, all come into a classroom unless we assumed that everyone was going to follow the rules. So while Bergson thinks that it is a lower form of morality, he doesn't think that it's unnecessary or to be completely thrown out. And Bergson gives this really great image. Again, Bergson is this kind of visualizer who loves to come up with these images of things. And he says that our ego or our personhood is kind of like these lily pads. So a lily pad has its own roots that go down into the soil and then come up through the water, and then the lily pads sit on the surface. And on the surface, the lily pads, if it's in a river or something like that, certain kinds of lily pads, they shoot out these tendrils, is that the word? And they interweave with each other so that they hold together as a cohesive whole on the surface. So Bergson says that this interweaving of the plants together is kind of like society. It holds them together when the current would rip out their roots. But their roots are what connect them to the earth and what give them nutrition and all of that. So there's these two forms of connection. There's the connection to our deeper self, and then there's the connection out into society. Really good image. So society holds us together and it gives us a cohesion, and it makes us stronger for that reason. But the other source of morality is the deep roots that go down into the soil. So Bergson gives this weird kind of psychoanalytic, almost reflective moment at the very beginning of the book. He says that in each of us there is this first memory. Let me read exactly what he says. There's a remembrance of forbidden fruit. It is the earliest thing in the memory of each of us, as it is in that of mankind. So he's obviously alluding to the Genesis story here of the forbidden fruit. But this idea of first memory, it's very weird. What is the first ever thing that we can remember, right? That's kind of what he's asking. And it's a very strange thing to say, but what he wants to say is that our first memory will always be when we encounter a prohibition. So I think what the idea here is that a child will be completely instinctual. They're going to follow their desires. They're never going to question their desires. They're going to want and want and want. And whatever they want, they're going to pursue that thing. And if they can't get it, they're going to cry and throw a fit and all these kinds of things, right? But when the child's desires and instincts have been socially, by their parents, denied to them, they've been prohibited from taking whatever they want, right? The desire leads them to do whatever they want. There's this forbidden fruit that arises when their parents say, no, you can't have that. You can't do that. So what we have in this first memory is our feeling of being denied our immediate desires. And what this is the first moment of our social conditioning. So the first memory for Bergson is the beginning of our social conditioning. And he says that this memory is covered over by habit. And why is that? Well, the moment when we're denied our fulfillment of our desires, we have begun our training, our habituation to society. Our parents have begun imposing a social pressure on us. So the first memory is really the memory of social pressure in general. And he says that it's something we don't really remember. It's kind of a repressed feeling. So he said, we should notice this, were not this recollection overlaid by others, which are we are more inclined to dwell upon. What a childhood we should have had if we had been left to our own to do what we pleased. We should have flitted from pleasure to pleasure, but all of a sudden an obstacle arose, neither visible nor tangible, a prohibition. So the obstacle is not our inability to get what we desire. It is an obstacle given to us by our parents, by an authority figure. We are told to obey. The prohibition says that we can't cross this line, right? The line is not something visible. It is something that, it's not something visible or tangible. It's something that is imposed on us, and we are told that we cannot cross this boundary. So this is the beginning of social conditioning, the beginning of our obligations to society. But then Bergson says that there's a second memory. And now, again, this is psychoanalytic. It's nearly metaphorical. It's not as if, like, this was the first thing we remembered and this is the second thing we remembered. The first and secondness here has to do with their role in forming our sense of obligation and our sense of morality. The second memory is the source of open morality. And the first is the source of closed morality. So all of our memories related to prohibitions are the social pressure of some authority figure telling us not to do something. But the second form of morality, the second memory, arises when we aren't able to rely on our pre-established moral ideas, when we don't know in a certain situation what we should do based on our social conditioning. So in this moment when our maxims fail, when we don't know what prohibitions of society we've been given for this situation, what arises is a memory of someone we could emulate. Like, what would my mom do in this situation? Like, let's say that my mom is someone who I feel is a very morally strong person, whose kind of moral instincts I would trust in basically any situation. So I'm in a situation where I don't know morally what would be the right thing to do. I don't have any maxims. I don't have any social conditioning that is telling me what to do in this situation. The universal reason and all of that can't apply to this situation. So what happens is I turn to this figure. I say, what would my mom do in this situation? She's someone who would know what to do, right? And what happens is I aspire to be able to do what this person would do. I aspire to understand or to imagine their ability to divine or to intuit the right thing to do. So the second memory is this aspiration, this feeling that it's possible to look beyond social conditioning to some greater emotional, creative tendency within humans, to be able to see beyond the societal, relative, conditioned form of good and bad, good and evil, and to see beyond that to some new, superior way of understanding. This is closely maybe related to this idea of, like, what would Jesus do? We look in these moments, we don't know what to do, and so we look to a figure who we could emulate. So this is the first and the second memory, and these are really the two sources of morality. Either we reenact, basically, what society has trained us to do, and then we have closed morality, or we feel the failure of that morality, and we look towards some aspiration. We are attracted by some idea hidden deep within our memory of the possibility of a higher form of morality. So I want to connect this two sources of morality to this kind of wordplay. It's not exactly wordplay, but there's this common link between all of these terms, which is this Latin word ligare, which actually means to unite or to bind, to weave things together. So we see in these words obligation, intelligence, religion, right? The same root word, ligare, to bind or connect. So An obligation is a way we are bound to society. Bergson defines obligation as a necessity or a feeling of necessity connected to the idea of possibly subverting that necessity, or of so it's something necessary but also possibly not necessary. So again, like this ant who wakes up suddenly to being conscious and thinks, maybe I could do something else. Obligation says it's necessary for you to not do that. You need to come back into the fold of society. So it's this kind of paradoxical idea. Obligation is a necessity that can be broken. I mean, a necessity is something that can't be broken. So that's why it's kind of a strange idea. But so obligation is this feeling of being bound to society. Intelligence is this inner binding of necessity that we see in things. So intelligence sees the necessary connections between things. Intelligence is the interlinking or interbinding of reality. So again, this kind of idea of binding here. And Bergson opposes intelligence to obligation and to religion as being something necessary, purely necessary, dealing only with things that are interlinking or bound by necessity. Religion, on the other hand, is the relinking, the being linked again, rebinding. So that's what the word literally means, religio, relinking. So religion is what reconnects us to either God or society or whatever it is. It relinks us back. So Bergson says that instinct relates to obligation in a similar way that nature relates to habit. So if by instinct we just do everything immediately, there's no hesitation, there's no relinking, there's no connecting in that way, because there's no break from necessity, right? If you act by instinct, there's no break from necessity. But this ant that wakes up and then feels the need to reconnect to society feels an obligation. So an obligation is secondary to instinct. Well, that's the same as habit and nature. Habit is a second nature. Well, obligation is a kind of second instinct. Hopefully that clears that idea up a lot. Closely linked for Bergson, this idea of linking or connecting things in religion and obligation. He thinks that there's an example that really highlights this feeling that we have. So a criminal, basically by that word I just mean someone who's broken the law. Someone who's broken the law breaks with society, because society is a group of people, under a contract, who agree to follow certain laws, who have been habituated, have adapted a certain social ego, and are expected to follow the rules of that ego. So a criminal is someone who has broken that. And oftentimes, more often than not, they desire to be reconnected to society. And so in order to be reconnected to society, what they need to do is they need to confess to someone. If they can confess to someone and that person accepts them, then they'll feel like they've been reattached to society. And I think all of us can probably relate to this on some level, that when you've done something wrong, you feel alienated from other people. And by admitting what you've done, you feel like you've been re-entered back into society, like society has taken you back in. We feel this pressure to be re-admitted into society. So one of the major ideas here for Bergson in his analysis of morality is the way that society is not something that we ever really grasp on a conceptual, representational basis. It's not something that we can confront directly. Society is a kind of vague feeling. It's not something present to consciousness. It's not something that can be given all at once. But it's a kind of feeling. It's something that sits on the periphery of our awareness. It's not explicable in any concepts or images or representations. It's this vague general feeling of obligation, this pressure. And where does this pressure come from? This is where Bergson begins the questioning. So we have this first memory, right, of our prohibition from our parents. But then this gradually unfolds further through our school teachers, through the state, and eventually through a god of closed morality and a god, and this transcendent reason, which, gives us a rational basis, very Kantian idea of like, why should I not lie? Well, because lying is rationally like not a coherent way of conducting myself. It's not a coherent maxim. I can't say that people should lie. So the authority takes on certain symbols, certain appearances, but it goes beyond them. And when we feel the need to put our shopping cart back in the corral, or to clean up our dog's poop or something like that, we don't just feel a singular, peculiar, particular feeling of obligation. We actually feel the entirety of obligation. And this is what Bergson is really getting at. Each of the individual moments of feeling obliged or obligated or feeling duty is actually like reinstating the authority of the totality. We never experience that totality, but it's the force behind every single prohibition. It's the enforcement of prohibition in general. So in all of these cases, what we feel is this vague sense of a need to preserve social order. And society is this never-present, vague, general feeling external to us, this pressure to preserve the social order. So the two sources, pressure and aspiration. Bergson gives many very vivid kind of descriptions of this, but he says that there's a difference of vital tone between them. They're really different in kind. They're not a difference in degree. You can't go gradually from one to the other. There would be an infinite number of steps required in order to do that. You have to make a leap from one to the next. He says, all right, and I mean, this comes across even in the terms pressure and aspiration. Pressure is like, it's like, if anything, you're expiring when you're under pressure rather than aspiring towards something. So one is a kind of crushing. The other one is a growing and a evolving, right? So he says, hence between the first morality and the second lies the whole distance between repose and movement. So again, for Bergson, repose and movement are absolutely different from one another. The first is supposed to be immutable, and if it changes, it immediately forgets that it has changed, or it acknowledges no change. So that's, again, this way in which society pretends as if its laws and customs and things like that had never changed, and that they are eternal, when really, when we look at history, they have evolved. And we're going to see this in a minute with the history of the evolution of morality. So the shape it assumes at any given time claims to be its final shape. This is similar with science, too. Science says, no, science is the knowledge we have of nature. That never changes. But you go look at the history of science, and it's changing all the time, and massively. Right now, there's massive foundational cracks in the system of science. Science is something that is always evolving, and it treats its knowledge as if it was absolute and inchangeable and immutable. But when you look at history, it's actually always changing. So he says, the second is a forward thrust, a demand for movement. It is the very essence of mobility. Thus, it would prove, thus alone indeed, would it be able at first to define its superiority. So its superiority is its ability to move and to change and to adapt. So postulate the first, you could never bring the second out of it, any more than you can from one or several positions of a movable body derive motion. So from immobility, from positions in space, you can never get movement. It's from movement that positions in space come about. In the same way, it's from an aspiration towards morality that closed morality comes about. Now, the closed morality forgets that and pretends that that wasn't what created it. It's almost like democracy comes about when someone abolishes all of the laws that came before and creatively produces a new society. As soon as it does that, it institutes its own laws, and it pretends that those laws are immutable and eternal. But it denies the fact that it actually required a creative act in order to come about. This is very closely related to Bergson's idea of habit and intellect. So habit and intellect are things that require there to be this aspiration, this movement of spirit, the creative act in which new concepts and new formulas can come about. Once they come about, we pretend as if they were always there, and as if they had always had the meaning that they have, and we deny the reality of that creative advancement. What Bergson is saying is that no, the creative advancement is what is real, right? It's the same thing like we saw with music. We think that the score is the music, but really what it is this opening up and progressing into the future. And really what it is the creative act of the artist who produced the new piece of music. And the new piece of music is a new feeling that no one has ever felt before. And once it exists, we think, oh, well, that is a settled, immovable form of repose kind of thing, when its reality was truly a mobility in creation. And again, we have this idea between expression and suggestion. An aspiration is a suggestion. It's something where we feel the possibility of something new. So Christ, for Bergson, is a figure who really encapsulates this. So Christ awakens in us, a sense of moral greatness, a sense of esteem for something beyond. There's an enthusiasm of a new possibility. And that's what Bergson characterizes under the idea of love. Love is this possibility of bringing about a greater future. It's this motivating suggestion that awakens in us this aspiration, enthusiasm for a new form of morality, a new way of understanding morality.